My abusive ex-boyfriend thought he could control my life forever by threatening every man who even looked at me. He was a constant shadow that followed me everywhere, a silent and suffocating ghost in the corner of every room I entered. For 2 long, agonizing years, I lived like a ghost myself, making my world smaller and smaller just to keep other people safe from his reach. But everything changed on a random Wednesday afternoon when my laptop died and I walked into a repair shop owned by a man who stood 6'5". My name is Madison. I am 27 years old, and this is the long and difficult story of how I finally took my power back from a monster. It all started 3 years ago when I finally found the tiny shred of courage I needed to leave Derek after 4 years of a living nightmare. That relationship felt more like a prison sentence than a partnership, filled with constant monitoring and subtle psychological warfare. Derek was the kind of man who used intense charm as a weapon until he had you completely trapped in his web. Once the door was locked and your friends were gone, he quickly switched from being a prince to using fear as his primary tool of control. When I finally moved out of our shared house, I thought I was walking into freedom, but I was actually walking into a different kind of trap. I quickly realized that Derek had absolutely no intention of letting go or letting me live a life that didn't revolve around him. The very day after I moved into my new, small apartment, I was at Target, buying basic supplies like cleaning spray and neutral-colored towels. A man about my age smiled at me in the cleaning supplies aisle, a simple, friendly gesture that happens 1,000 times a day to normal people. I smiled back instinctively because I wanted to feel like a normal, visible human being again for at least a few seconds. 2 hours later, Derek was banging on my new front door so hard the wooden frame started to rattle and groan. He screamed through the wood that he had seen me at Target and he knew I was flirting with that random guy in the aisle. I still to this day do not know how he found my new address so quickly, or how he managed to follow me there without being seen. I called the police in a state of pure panic, but by the time the officers arrived, Derek was the perfect picture of calm and reason. He leaned against the wall and told the officers we had just broken up and that he was simply being an emotional ex-boyfriend. The officers looked at me, saw no bruises, and basically told us both to grow up and move on with our separate lives. That was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch on for months, turning into a multi-year ordeal of isolation. A few weeks later, I was at a quiet coffee shop downtown, trying to focus on my graphic design work while sipping a latte. A young barista made a small, innocent joke while handing me my drink, and I gave him a small, polite laugh. I didn't even see Derek sitting in the far corner of the shop, hidden behind a newspaper, watching me like a predator in the tall grass. The next morning, that 19-year-old barista found all 4 of his tires slashed and his windshield smashed in the shop's parking lot. I knew deep in my soul it was Derek, even if the police said there wasn't enough physical evidence or security footage to prove it. Then there was the terrifying incident at my local gym where a man simply asked if I was finished using the leg press machine. Derek followed that man to the parking lot and got right in his face, telling him he would regret it if he ever spoke to me again. The man came back inside shaken and complained to the management, who eventually banned Derek from the property for harassment. But it didn't really matter because Derek didn't need to be inside the building to make sure I knew he was watching from his car. For 2 years, this became my daily reality, a slow erosion of my social life and my sense of self-worth. I stopped smiling at strangers, I stopped making eye contact with anyone, and I stopped going to the Sunday farmers market I once loved. I became practically invisible because I couldn't bear the heavy thought of another innocent person getting hurt just for being kind to me. I applied for a restraining order twice, but Derek was always one step ahead of the legal system and its many loopholes. He never threatened me directly with physical violence. He only targeted the men who occupied the space around me. He always had a way to make the vandalism and the threats look like a series of unfortunate coincidences or random street crime. My friends eventually stopped calling because they were tired of the drama, and my mother begged me every week to come home to Ohio. But I had built a successful career in Austin, Texas, as a freelance designer, and I refused to let a bully win by running away. So instead of fleeing, I stayed and lived like a voluntary prisoner in my own apartment, only leaving when it was absolutely necessary. Then came that humid Wednesday afternoon when my laptop hard drive crashed right in the middle of a massive project deadline. I was panicking, practically in tears from the stress, when I stumbled into a small electronics repair shop just 2 blocks from my office. That was the moment I met Cameron, and my world shifted on its axis for the first time in years. When I walked into the shop, I actually took a physical step back because of how incredibly massive he was behind the counter. I am only 5'4", and I felt like a child as I tilted my head all the way back to meet his steady gaze. He had broad shoulders that seemed to take up the entire room, and hands that looked like they could crush a bowling ball. His nose was slightly crooked, like it had been broken and reset a few times, and he had a jagged white scar through his left eyebrow. He looked like a man you would normally avoid on a dark street. But when he opened his mouth, his voice was the gentlest sound I had heard. He told me to take a deep breath, that everything would be okay, and he offered me a seat and a water while he looked at the drive. Internal alarms were screaming in my head, telling me to grab my laptop and run before Derek saw me talking to this giant. I wanted to warn him that being nice to me was a dangerous game that usually ended with property damage or personal threats. But I was desperate to save my work and my reputation with my client, so I just sat there in silence and watched him work. An hour later, he handed me back my laptop, completely restored, and he flat out refused to charge me a single cent for the labor. He called it a first-time customer discount and gave me a warm, genuine grin that made me realize I hadn't seen a kind man in years. I felt a strange and unfamiliar sense of peace standing near him, a feeling of weightlessness that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because he was so physically imposing that my brain couldn't imagine Derek being able to intimidate someone like him. I thanked him profusely and walked out of the shop, but as I reached the end of the block, my heart sank into my shoes. I saw Derek leaning against a brick wall across the street, his arms crossed, wearing that cold, predatory smile I knew so well. I spent the rest of the night feeling physically sick, waiting for the phone to ring with news that the repair shop had been burned down. I even drove past the shop at midnight, sitting in the shadows of my car and watching for Derek's silver sedan in the rearview mirror. But to my utter shock, nothing happened that night, or the next night, or the entire weekend that followed. The following Monday, I walked past the shop during my lunch break and saw Cameron through the large glass window. He saw me, stopped what he was doing, and waved at me with a big, bright smile that made my heart do a nervous flips. I waved back, my pulse racing against my ribs, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't immediately look around for Derek. A week later, I decided to be brave and go back to the farmer's market for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I was carefully picking out some heirloom tomatoes when I heard a deep, familiar voice call my name from behind the stand. It was Cameron, dressed in an old sweat-stained tank top and carrying a heavy reusable bag full of fresh green vegetables. Without the counter of the shop between us, he looked even more massive, his arms thick with functional muscle and old sparring scars. He invited me to grab a breakfast burrito from his favorite vendor, and for some reason, the word yes came out of my mouth before I could stop it. We found a spot under a large, ancient oak tree and talked for nearly 2 hours about everything and nothing at the same time. He told me about growing up in a small town in Minnesota and how he moved to Austin 5 years ago to start his own business. He also casually mentioned that he was a semi-professional MMA fighter with a record of 12 fights and 9 wins. He explained that professional fighting had taught him the value of discipline and the heavy responsibility of carrying physical power. He said that when you truly know how to hurt someone, you become much more careful about making sure you never have to do it. I felt a sudden, uncontrollable urge to tell this stranger everything about the nightmare I had been living through. I told him about Derek, the years of stalking, the slashed tires, and the trail of men who had been bullied into leaving me alone. I fully expected him to look worried, to check his watch, or to find a polite excuse to get as far away from me as possible. Instead, he looked me right in the eyes, his expression unchanging, and told me that he was absolutely not afraid of a coward like my ex. He then asked me, with a quiet confidence that was incredibly attractive, if I would still like to go to a real dinner with him on Tuesday. I was terrified during the entire meal at the restaurant, my eyes constantly darting toward the entrance every time the door opened. But Derek never appeared, and for the first time in years, I finished a meal without feeling like I was about to be sick. Cameron walked me all the way to my car, stood by the door until I was safely inside, and asked if he could see me again very soon. We started dating seriously after that, seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week as my walls slowly began to crumble. He was the most patient and respectful man I had ever known, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He made me feel safe in a way that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with his character and his kindness. Still, I couldn't understand why Derek was suddenly leaving me alone after 2 years of relentless and daily harassment. It felt like I was living in the eye of a hurricane, just waiting for the wind to pick back up and destroy my newfound happiness. 3 weeks into our relationship, Cameron invited me to watch him compete in a regional MMA championship match downtown. The raw intensity and the controlled violence of the cage were initially shocking to someone who hated conflict as much as I did. But seeing Cameron move with such lethal precision made me realize just how much strength he was holding back in his daily life. He knocked his opponent out in the middle of the second round and immediately looked into the crowd to find my face. He climbed the cage and blew me a kiss in front of 1,000 cheering people, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to hide. That night, as we sat in his truck in the quiet parking lot, he finally told me the truth about what had happened with Derek. He said that about 2 weeks prior, Derek had actually gathered the nerve to walk into the repair shop while Cameron was working alone. Derek had started his usual routine of vague threats and intimidation, telling Cameron to stay away from me or suffer the consequences. Cameron told me he didn't say a word at first. He just sat on his stool and listened to every single word Derek had to say. He let Derek finish his entire rehearsed speech about how he owned this town and how he would make Cameron's life a living hell. Then, Cameron slowly stood up to his full 6'5" height, walked around the counter, and loomed over my terrified ex-boyfriend. He told Derek exactly what he did for a living and showed him his calloused knuckles and the scars from a decade of training. He told Derek that he had been hit by the best professional strikers in the country and that a little bully with a silver sedan didn't move the needle. Cameron made a very specific promise to Derek. If he ever contacted me again, or even drove past my apartment, Cameron would find him. He told Derek that it wasn't a threat intended to scare him. It was a simple, clinical guarantee of the physical consequences that would follow. Derek tried to maintain his tough guy persona for about 10 more seconds, but then he looked at Cameron's eyes and saw no fear. He realized in that moment that his psychological games didn't work on someone who lived in a world of physical reality and hard consequences. Derek simply turned around, walked out of the shop without saying another word, and he hasn't been back since that day. I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity of it or cry from the sheer relief of finally being protected by someone who cared. I felt a physical weight that I had been carrying for nearly 1,000 days finally lift off my chest, allowing me to breathe. Cameron took my hands in his and told me that I had spent enough of my life trying to protect everyone else from Derek's madness. He said it was his turn to be the shield, and that I finally had the permission to just be Madison again, without the fear. That conversation happened 4 months ago, and Derek has not made a single attempt to contact me or anyone in my circle since then. For the first time since my early 20s, I am truly and completely free to live my life on my own terms. We moved in together last month into a charming little 2-bedroom house with a fenced-in yard in a very quiet neighborhood. I am still in the process of learning how to live without the constant hum of anxiety in the back of my mind every single day. Healing from years of emotional abuse isn't a straight line, and I still have moments where my heart rate spikes for no reason. Sometimes a car will slow down near our house, and I'll find myself holding my breath until I see that it's just a neighbor. But then I look at Cameron, usually hunched over a tiny circuit board at our kitchen table, and I remember that the war is over. Recently, a young woman named Amber reached out to me on social media after hearing a rumor about why I left my ex. She had started dating Derek a few months ago and was starting to see the exact same red flags that had nearly destroyed me. I met her for a long coffee and didn't sugarcoat a single detail of the 4 years of hell I went through with that man. I gave her the warning and the validation that no one was able to give me when I was her age and just as vulnerable. Amber broke up with him that same evening, and when Derek tried to show up at her apartment to intimidate her, he got a surprise. Cameron and I drove over there together and sat in his truck right behind Derek's car, just watching him in silence. Cameron didn't even have to get out of the vehicle this time. His presence alone was enough to make Derek realize the game was up. We also made sure Derek knew that we had documented his behavior and that his employer, the financial firm, would be notified. We told him that professional firms usually don't look kindly on employees who have a documented history of stalking multiple women. Derek drove away in a hurry and hasn't bothered Amber since, proving that bullies only thrive when they think their victims are isolated. We broke the cycle of abuse together, and knowing that I helped save another woman from my fate was the best feeling in the world. Last week, Cameron won another major fight and used his post-match interview to dedicate the win to his beautiful fiancée. He told the crowd and the cameras that meeting me had reminded him that the greatest use of strength is to protect the vulnerable. We are currently planning a small, intimate wedding for next summer, and my best friend Jessica has already picked out her dress. I am slowly taking back every single piece of my life that Derek tried to steal from me over those lost years. I am going back to the gym without fear. I am smiling at my neighbors, and I am finally thriving in my career as a designer. I have realized that abuse is a sickness designed to make your world feel small, dark, and hopeless. But real love is the opposite. It is meant to expand your horizons and make your world feel infinite and bright. Cameron didn't just fix my laptop that day. He helped me fix a life that had been broken by a man who didn't deserve me. Derek is now facing serious legal consequences because Amber, Rachel, and 3 other women have joined me in filing statements. The imaginary power he thought he held over us was built entirely on our silence and our individual fear of his retaliation. Once we stood together as a united front, that power evaporated into nothing, leaving him as the small, pathetic man he always was. I will be in that courtroom next month, standing tall and speaking my truth, and I know Cameron will be right there in the front row. I am no longer the terrified girl who hides in her apartment and prays to be invisible so that no one else gets hurt. I am a woman who is deeply loved, widely respected, and for the first time in my adult life, I am completely safe. Sometimes I think about that old, broken laptop and how its failure was actually the greatest stroke of luck I ever had. It led me to the man who showed me that true strength is found in gentleness and that real protection is rooted in mutual respect. My name is Madison Chen, and I am finally living the beautiful, loud, and fearless life I was always meant to have. If you are watching this right now and you feel trapped in a dark room of someone else's making, please listen to me. You do not need to date a professional fighter to find your voice, but you do need to believe that you are worth defending. The world is so much bigger and kinder than the person who is currently trying to convince you that you are nothing. Take your power back, one small conversation and one small step at a time until you can run toward the light. I can promise you from experience that the view from the other side of fear is the most beautiful thing you will ever see. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story and for walking this path of healing with me today. I am going home now to a house full of laughter and to the man who chooses to stand beside me every single day. And for the very first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and I know exactly where I belong. The end of that long, dark nightmare was just the necessary beginning of the bright rest of my life.